کنفرانس جهانی همزمان با اعلام حکم دادگاه. ارتباط زنده آنلاین با مجاهدین در اشرف 3، دادگاه آنتورپ، شخصیتهای بین المللی و شاکیان خصوصی و یاران شورشگر. 3000 نقطه در 40 کشور جهان.
قسمت هفتم. سخنرانی های دیوید جونز، نماینده پارلمان انگلستان، میچل ریس، مدیر پیشین سیاستگذاری در وزارت خارجه آمریکا، ماریا کاندیدا آلمیدا، دادستان کل پیشین پرتغال، سر آلن میل، عضو افتخاری شورای اروپا از انگلستان و لارش ریسه، کمیته دوستان ایران آزاد در نروژ. دیوید جونز، نماینده پارلمان انگلستان. بعد از حکم دادگاه بلژیک، وزیر کشور انگلستان باید به طور اضطراری نامگذاری تروریستی سپاه پاسداران را در تمامیتش بررسی کند. اقدامی که اخیراً توسط کمیته خارجی پارلمان انگلستان توصیه شده است و حمایت فراحزبی در هر دو مجلس پارلمان دارد. میچل ریس، مدیر سیاستگذاری در وزارت خارجه آمریکا 2005. رژیم ایران از هیئت‌های دیپلماتیک خود برای حمایت از یک شبکه تروریستی جهانی استفاده می‌کند. آنها از شورای ملی مقاومت و سازمان مجاهدین خلق وحشت دارند و دست به ترور می‌زنند.
ماریا کاندیدا آلمیدا، دادستان کل پرتغال 2015. زمان آن فرا رسیده است که کشورها و رهبران اتحادیه اروپا در کنار مردم ایران و آرزوی آنها برای یک ایران آزاد و دموکراتیک که حامی حقوق بشر، آزادی‌ها و برابری است بایستند.
سر آلن میل، عضو افتخاری شورای اروپا از انگلستان. کاری که ما باید بکنیم این است که تمام رابطه‌های خارجی و دیپلماتیک با رژیم ایران را قطع کنیم. لارش ریسه، کمیته دوستان ایران آزاد در نروژ.
رژیم ایران بیش از 40 سال است که به اعمال تروریستی دست می‌زند. آنها در این سالها از روانشناسی معکوس استفاده کردند. اپوزیسیون را تروریست خواندند در حالی که آنها خودشان مجرم بودند. کنفرانس جهانی همزمان با اعلام حکم دادگاه. ارتباط زنده آنلاین با مجاهدین در اشرف 3، دادگاه آنتورپ، شخصیتهای بین المللی و شاکیان خصوصی و یاران شورشگر. 3000 نقطه در 40 کشور جهان.
قسمت هفتم. سخنرانی های دیوید جونز، نماینده پارلمان انگلستان، میچل ریس، مدیر پیشین سیاستگذاری در وزارت خارجه آمریکا، ماریا کاندیدا آلمیدا، دادستان کل پیشین پرتغال، سر آلن میل، عضو افتخاری شورای اروپا از انگلستان و لارش ریسه، کمیته دوستان ایران آزاد در نروژ.
I'm very pleased to be with you today for this important conference. And I'm particularly pleased that it's attended virtually by Mrs. Mariam Rajavi and residents of Ashraf 3. This morning's verdict of the Antwerp court in the trial of the Iranian diplomat Asdallah and his 3 accomplices, who were sentenced to maximum terms of imprisonment for terrorist offences, is an event of the most profound international importance. It puts an end to the false narrative that the acts of terrorism of which they were accused were the work of hardliners or so-called rogue elements within the Iranian regime. Asadi is an accredited diplomat, and therefore the entire regime must answer for his actions, including the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Javad Zarif. After today's verdict, we in the United Kingdom are now looking to the British government to announce what action it will be taking to counter Iran's state terrorism, which has now been shown beyond doubt to pose a serious threat to the security of the United Kingdom and Europe. One immediate step should be for the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, to give urgent consideration to proscribing the IRGC in its entirety as a terrorist organization, a move that was recently recommended by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee and has wide cross-party support in both houses of Parliament. There are growing calls from parliamentarians for Dominic Raab and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to work with the Home Office to pursue such a proscription, which should also extend to the entirety of Iran's intelligence ministry, part of which was proscribed by the UK and the EU in January 2019, for their part in the bomb plot against the NCRI's gathering in Paris. The UK and the EU should both toughen their current conciliatory policy on Iran. That policy has, to a large extent, emboldened the regime and has led it to believe that it could get away with terrorist activities on European soil, targeting the pro-democracy opposition and its leader, Mrs. Rajavi. Global Britain should take the lead in developing firm policy on Iran at an international level. This should include downgrading diplomatic relations with Iran and contemplating the closure of Iran's embassies and, where appropriate, the expulsion of diplomats, given the regime's role in promoting terrorism on European soil and holding British and European citizens hostage. Any return to a normal relationship should then be contingent upon the verifiable dismantling by Iran of its terrorist apparatus and credible undertakings not to engage in state terrorism again. Finally, I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the work of the NCRI and its president-elect, Mrs. Rajavi. This is undoubtedly an historic day for the Iranian people and the popular struggle for a free and democratic Iran. And congratulations also, too, to the law enforcement agencies on the European continent. Their hard work and professionalism has ensured that those who terrorize the people of Iran and seek to export their terrorist activities are brought to justice. My best wishes to the people of Iran and the cause of justice in that great country. Thank you.
We need to ask ourselves, why did the Iranian regime so fear this gathering outside Paris that it was willing to risk alienating all of Europe and all civilized people around the world by engaging in such an act of blatant terror? The answer is clear. The gathering was organized by the NCRI and MEK, organizations that have been working tirelessly for decades to bring about a democratic Iran based on truly free elections with rule of law and respect for all Iranian citizens. The values that the NCRI and MEK represent are universal values enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These values, however, represent an existential threat to the decades of misrule and tyranny by the mullahs and their foot soldiers of the regime. They fear these values. They fear the NCRI and MEK. So they feel they must respond the only way they know best, with violence and terror. They seek to silence all opposition by force. And that's why this terror operation was approved at the very high of the Iranian regime. Because today's leaders in Iran know that terror is the only way that they can maintain their grip on power. History tells us that such an approach is destined to fail. Regimes that have defied the will of the people do not last. This regime, too, is destined to fail. Every attempt to silence their critics by violence, whether outside Paris or on the streets across Iran, proves that the mullahs understand and fear this historical truth as well. Now, no one knows when the day of reckoning for the mullahs will come, but we know that it is coming. We also know that our actions can accelerate the timetable for when this day does come. So what do we need to do now? First, with this trial, the proof of Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism is undeniable. The United States and every European government should immediately condemn the regime for this behavior. But beyond mere words, these governments need to take solid actions that demonstrate that this behavior will not be tolerated in the future. It's clear that Iran uses its diplomatic missions to support a global terror network. So every government needs to assess carefully all of Iran's diplomatic personnel around the world and expel all employees who are not engaged in purely diplomatic work. Also, the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, needs to be held accountable for what occurred by one of his so-called diplomats. He should not be invited to Europe. He should not be seen as a legitimate foreign ministry official responsible for negotiating diplomatic arrangements with other countries. Finally, all these governments and non-governmental organizations across Europe and the United States need to redouble their efforts to help the long-suffering Iranian people. Support for a democratic alternative inside Iran would communicate to brave Iranians that they are not alone in their struggle, that their voices are heard, and that the free world is with them in spirit and hope. Thank you.
Dear Mrs. Rajavi, dear friends, this is a very good day to be with you. Today is a day for justice to be served. I was present in the gathering with many distinguished guests. I joined many human representatives of NGOs and activists to express our solidarity with Mrs. Rajavi's 10 points plan for a free Iran. I joined the distinguished personalities to express my support for the Iranian people and their desire for a free country that stands for human rights. If the attack would have succeeded, it would have been a disaster, and we are happy that today we are here to celebrate this ruling and defend the rule of law. I have been a prosecutor in my country for over 45 years, and I understand that the law comes first. You cannot distract the law under any circumstances. It is unacceptable to use immunity to get away with terrorism and crimes against people. It's time for the EU states and leaders to stand with the Iranian people and their desire for a free, democratic Iran that stands for human rights, liberty, and equality. Thank you.
The situation with the Antwerp court in the Asadi declaration to the court's decision is one way, and that way is to ensure guilt, and then punishment accordingly to that. It's important because here we have a very unusual situation where Saadi actually decided on the directions of his superiors in the diplomatic movement of Iran and tried to organize a situation with the Paris conference whereby thousands of people's lives were put at risk. Now, it is an absolute bottom line in the diplomatic arena that any diplomat should never engage in this kind of terrorist activities. And in Europe, we have a laid down set of rules that it shouldn't participate. Now, it's not good enough, and it's not good enough for governments the world over to stand idly by and say nothing or do nothing about this instance. It was profound. And what we've got to do, in my opinion, is to break off all international and diplomatic relations with Iran and give them a message that until they give guarantees that this situation will never arise again, they won't be restored. The situation is that this kind of behavior is profoundly wrong and is against every rule in the book in any free part of the free world. So much stop. And the governments of the world must learn from it. They must remember that on a daily basis, there are murders in Iran, there are imprisonments, wrongly imprisonments in Iran, there are torture in Iran, there's people who've displaced in Iran. It goes on, and all in the name of oil. People stand idly by and do nothing. Well, I say enough is enough. Now is the time to step forward and do whatever is necessary to gain a free Iran.
Mrs. Rajavi, Excellencies, friends in Ashraf, ladies and gentlemen. This is a historic day, not only for the opposition, but for the whole world that wants to see a free Iran. The brutal realities of the Iranian regime is being displayed in the courtroom today. And now, after the verdicts, we can see as a reality because of undisputable evidence that the foreign minister of Iran, Mr. Javad Zarif, has been the architect behind the horrible plot. He took his instructions from the National Security Council, headed by President Hassan Rouhani, blessed by the supreme religious leader Khamenei. If this evil terrorist act had succeeded, they would all have been guilty in committing crimes against humanity, which they, by the way, are already guilty of. After receiving the verdict today, all European leaders planning to meet with Javad Zarif should be clear about one thing on their to-do list. I have to get issued an arrest order for Javad Zarif. He has committed crimes against humanity and should be sent to The Hague, where he should be held responsible for working out and giving instructions to execute this evil plan. How is it possible to work with the regime for anybody as if nothing happened? I was present at the event on the 30th of June 2018, together with my wife and my two daughters. I was completely unaware of the drama which took place as the two terrorists were arrested on their way towards the conference hall to kill all of us, the speakers, the guests, and the leadership of the MEK and NCRI, including Mrs. Mariam Rajavi. We have learned through the court case that the capacity of the bomb sent through the border in diplomatic luggage was enough to kill several hundreds of people. Those who planned this big explosion must have been aware of how risky it would be to try to execute the operation on European soil, knowing very well that the agents of the regime are being monitored and followed constantly by several intelligence services. In a way, the willingness to go forward with the plans, in spite of the high risk, shows that the regime is desperate. The Iranian regime has committed terrorist acts for more than 40 years. They have used reverse psychology methods all these years, and naming the opposition as the terrorists while they were actually the guilty ones themselves. But this is the first time a diplomat has been caught in the act. It is interesting that the evidence presented in the court was so overwhelming that the lawyers of the regime did not even try to oppose the validity of the tapes, transcripts, photos, and footage. Now is the time to act. Now is the time for the leaders in Europe to hold the regime legally responsible for the crimes they have committed. And for those governments who are hesitant to actually get Javid Zarif arrested and sent to The Hague, what about doing something? Close the embassies, deny him coming, don't invite him, don't have meetings with him. It's time to stand together, stand up for democracy and human rights in Iran, and hope for the day for the freedom to come very soon. Thank you very much.